Abortion rights advocates held rallies across the country today in the wake of recent state laws that seek to restrict the procedure. Protesters gathered in San Francisco, Nashville, and on the steps of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. According to the group organizing the events, #StopTheBans, rallies were held in at least 38 states. However, the group's website did not list events in Alabama or Georgia where legislation restricting abortion access was passed in recent weeks. According to a new CBS News poll, 2/3 of Americans think the Supreme Court should keep Roe v. Wade as it is. Only 28% want the Supreme Court to overturn the landmark abortion ruling. The issue has entered the 2020 conversation. Here's what some of the Democrats running said today outside the Supreme Court.
This is the beginning of a long march. This is the beginning of President Trump's war on women. If he wants this war, he will have this war and he will lose.
They started by trying to defund Planned Parenthood, right? Then they move into trying to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act and that ban on pre-existing conditions. And now, in Alabama and Georgia, they try to completely ban the right to abortion. Are we gonna let them? We are.
I'm happy to see everybody here, but fellas, to all the men that are here, we must wake up more men to join this fight. And it's not because we have daughters and mothers and wives. It's because this is an issue for all people. It's about the rights of all people.
And joining me now from our Washington bureau is CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. And here with me in New York is CBSNews.com reporter Kate Smith, who has been reporting on the state abortion bills. Kate, let me start with you. Remind us what is in these actual bills that is sparking these protests.
What you're seeing in these bills are extreme anti-abortion bans. They go further than we've really ever seen in recent history. The most common one is the so-called fetal heartbeat bill. And that's effectively a 6-week ban on abortion. But then Alabama's bill, and that is the most restrictive abortion ban we have seen since Roe v. Wade, that is a near total abortion ban. Once a woman knows she is pregnant in Alabama, according to this law, she would no longer be able to receive an abortion. And there are no exceptions for rape or incest.
So we know abortion bills in Georgia and Alabama have already been signed into law. In Missouri, a bill is headed to the governor's desk. But what about the rest of the country?
There are actually many states who are actually going the entirely opposite direction and looking to protect abortion access. So New York, obviously, in January signed the Reproductive Act, which was a sweeping piece of legislation that allowed women to get an abortion all the way up until term, of course, assuming that their baby is not viable anymore in accordance with Planned Parenthood v. Casey. But then just today, you saw the California State Senate pass a law that would actually make medical abortions, so that's an abortion that happens via a pill, that would be at no cost to students at every single public university health center. And that was just passed today. They're expecting it to go to the Assembly, and the governor of California has already said that he would sign that bill.
Interesting. Well, Caitlin, I'd like to turn to that new CBS News poll. When you break it down by party, Democrats are almost united in opposition to abortion restriction, but Republicans are split on the issue. Does that present an opening for Democrats?
You know, especially heading into the 2020 campaign, Republicans wanted to paint Democrats as extremists on the issue of abortion, and it had traditionally worked for them before. Now, with what's going on in the states, and you're seeing this reaction not only outside the Supreme Court today, but across the country, as some Republicans starting to rethink that strategy and thinking it could actually backfire against them now that Democrats are able to point to some Republican measures at it as extreme. What was also interesting in that poll was that 48% of Republicans thought that abortion should be available with limits. And as we know, some of the legislation that has come out of the states doesn't allow for any exceptions. So you are seeing a split view among Republicans on this. You also saw Gallup polling last year that found a majority majority of those who describe themselves as pro-life still believe there should be exceptions for things like rape and incest and, of course, life of the mother.
Well, one area that has been a winning issue for Republicans is the Supreme Court. And Caitlin, you spoke to former South Dakota Senator Tom Daschle about this. Here's what he had to say.
Another big issue this week that's being talked about in the Democratic primary and across the country, this issue of abortion rights. Democrats have not really rallied around the idea of nominating Supreme Court justices or federal judgeships across the country the way that Republicans have. Do you see the tide turning? Are the courts going to be kind of a galvanizing force for Democrats the way they are for Republicans in 2020?
I don't think there's any question the courts will remain a galvanizing force on both sides. Democrats generally don't believe in litmus tests. They don't believe that that there is one critical issue that requires either for or against a certain nominee. But I do think that women's health and women's rights and women's freedom is increasingly going to be a rallying factor and a very important question that candidates are going to be asked about.
I mean, so Caitlin, can Democrats turn the Supreme Court into an issue that will actually drive their voters to the polls?
It's a really big question, one that I have and I'm going to be watching over the course of this campaign. Can they act like Republicans have traditionally been able to do to really motivate voters around the idea of the court? We saw after the nomination and then confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh that Democrats really had to step back and take a look at how they were messaging on the issue of the courts and whether it was actually getting through to voters that this is something that they should not only care about but vote on. On the Republican side, you've seen operatives on that side be able to really mobilize people around the courts. It's something that allowed Republicans to really coalesce around Donald Trump, even those that didn't support him initially. Democrats don't really have that same infrastructure in place as Republicans do, at least at this point, to not only get people to vote on these issues, but to also provide some kind of pipeline for judicial nominees. You saw, though, Kirsten Gillibrand, who said that she would not support any or nominate any justices to the Supreme Court who did not uphold Roe v. Wade. So establishing that litmus test. And I think with what you're seeing coming out of the states, and you saw several of those 2020 candidates going to the Supreme Court steps today, I do think that this shows at least somewhat of a turn. The question is, can Democrats sustain this momentum and keep the fire towards Republicans on this issue?
Well, meanwhile, Caitlin, President Trump campaigned in Pennsylvania last night where he took a shot at Joe Biden for, quote unquote, deserting his home state to become a senator from Delaware. And lately, the president has really been mostly critical of just one candidate, Joe Biden. So what's the strategy here?
That's right. I mean, Joe Biden left Pennsylvania when he was 11, so I don't think he had much of a choice in that. So it was an interesting dig that the president was trying to make at him. But there are a couple of schools of thought here. One is that the president cannot get Joe Biden out of his head. Joe Biden, unlike the other 2020 candidates, waged his campaign going specifically after Donald Trump. And we didn't really see the other candidates do that. So he is occupying some space in the president's head. And we see that as he responds, even against the advice of some around him who don't want him to elevate Joe Biden in that way. There's another school of thought, though, that Joe Biden can be somewhat of a foil to Donald Trump. Remember, in some ways, they're trying to go after similar voters. Joe Biden is campaigning in places like Pennsylvania and elsewhere that Democrats lost in 2016 and want to win back. In some ways, the president can point to Joe Biden and say, look, this is someone who voted for NAFTA, supported the Iraq War, and represents kind of the establishment, and use that to run against him. But it really remains to be seen whether and how the president can restrain himself going after Joe Biden, and whether that actually backfires by elevating him as a candidate.
Well, before we let you go, Caitlin, I'd like to play a clip from presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg responding to President Trump's comments on his marriage to his husband, Chasten. Let's listen.
President Trump was asked about you and your husband, Chasten, being up on stage. together. And he said, I have no problem with it whatsoever. I think it's good. What did you think of that?
That's nice. I'm more interested in policies that affect LGBTQ people. It's during this same week, maybe the same day that came out, that we, at least that I learned about this State Department policy that effectively alienates the children of same-sex couples from their parents by saying that they were born out of wedlock if you're doing surrogacy or adoption abroad, which is discrimination. The Equality Act is moved through the House. I doubt that this president will champion the Equality Act. And that's a shame, because if he really believes in equality, then he has a chance to make it so that he can't be discriminated against in this country based on who you are. What somebody says in an interview is one thing. How they govern is another.
Caitlin, it was so fascinating to hear that answer. What do you make of that response?
I agree. Really interesting how he was able to draw that contrast with the president. And that's something that Democratic voters say that they're looking for when they're watching these candidates, what they would kind of look like against Donald Trump. And Pete Buttigieg obviously has been on the cover of Time magazine with his husband, was on stage with his husband when he announced his campaign. A recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll that found that 67% of Americans would be fine with a gay president. So it seems like as a candidate, Buttigieg is not only talking about this as an issue, but using it as a way to contrast the president. We've seen him specifically go after Vice President Mike Pence, of course, from his home state of Indiana, drawing contrast on religion and faith, and using this as an issue. So it'll be really interesting to watch how candidates like Mayor Pete Buttigieg and others use identity politics, or things that were used to be described as identity politics, in a way that advances their cause.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns and Kate Smith, thank you.